This tutorial is going to cover making a beveled plate for an outlet or for the door assembly where a knob would be on top of it and perhaps a keyhole, and even the angle irons that will appear in the corners of our crate texture when we do that tutorial as well. So it's a good general all-purpose way to make metal beveled plates. I'm going to start with a new layer. I'm going to go to my swatches and I'm going to choose 50% gray. And I'm going to get my marquee tool. And I'm going to draw a tall rectangular shape. And I'm going to fill it with the gray. Now in order to do that, I could paint it in. I could hit G on the keyboard and get my paint bucket if I wanted. Or I could hold down the Option key and hit the Delete key. And that will put the foreground color on our swatch toolbar into that selection. Now before I deselect, I'm going to save that selection because I'm going to need that. So I'll go Select, Save Selection, and I'll call it Plate Outline. And then I'm going to get my marquee tool. I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose Transform Selection. And I want to scale this in. I'm going to hold the Option key and I'm going to do one side at a time because I'm trying to determine the selection shape I want to apply the bevel I would like. So you can see now that what I've got is a selection that's simply a smaller version of what I had created originally. I'm going to save that as well. And now I'm going to go to O on my keyboard because we're going to be using the Dodge and Burn tool to make this texture. So I'll start out with a good sized brush. I guess maybe I'll bump it up to about 80 or 100 pixels. I'm going to right click and make sure that the hardness is completely off on that. I'll check to make sure that maybe I'll start with an exposure of about 50. So if I would hit 5 on the keyboard, the exposure will automatically change. And because this gray is a middle value, I want to make sure that the range is set for midtones. Now if I were to hit Command H to hide that selection, and I were to paint across my document, I'm starting to get these dark values. Now usually reflections on a metal surface, in this case, that will color eventually, it usually is a combination of darks and middle values and whites. So I think what I'll do is to define the shape a little more pronounced initially. I'm going to go very gradually just around the perimeters here just to highlight a bit the very edge, just to define it. And then once I've got that, I've got the parameters to work with, I'll probably go and start to add a few more of these. And it really is up to your own discretion how much you want to add, how big the reflection should look, etc. It's something you would just have to play around with. All right, so I've got my dark values in. Now I'm going to put some light values in. So I'll go back to my Dodge and Burn tool, and if I were to click on it, I'm going to choose the lollipop shape, and that's the one that's going to allow us to introduce light values. Now we're going to be working up in this mid-gray again, so we can leave that at mid-tones. If the exposure is too high, in this case it was set for 100, I'll probably drop it down to about 40, and then I'm going to make sure the hardness is off on my brush, and I'll bump the scale up. Now again, the scale of the brush is really your call here, so I'm going to go ahead and put that a little higher, and then I'll kind of go through like so. Maybe the brush is too big and I'll just kind of minimize it a bit more. I might drop down the exposure or the opacity of the brush if you want to refer to it that way. So I've got a good start here. Now it's starting to drop out here with the middle tones of the front of the plate, again meeting the outside perimeter. But that's okay because now we're going to load our selection, invert it, and then darken this perimeter outside so that it seems to bevel back further than the surface on the front here. So I'm going to deselect and then I'll go to Select, Load Selection, and I'm going to go with the inner bevel again. I'll click OK, and now I'm going to invert that selection by going to Select and Inverse. I'm going to start once again with the burn tool. So I'll go ahead to my dodge and burn tool, click on it, get the hand. Once again, this is a middle tone, so we can leave that middle tone exposure, and then the amount of the exposure is really kind of subjective. I'm going to hide that selection because very often the selection really kind of distracts from the area we would like to work. So now what I'll probably do is start to darken outside the edges of that whole front panel, just to define it a little bit better perhaps. I'm darkening it just enough so it appears to have perhaps almost like an outline. Now, if I need to be precise, and it's always a good idea with this kind of stuff to be precise, if I hold my shift key and drag, I can get a straight line. So I'll do that just to keep it from getting too irregular around the perimeter. I'm probably going to go around to the outside perimeter as well. So I'll go to the outside now, and I'll do the same thing. Now, if you want to do, you could always bump up the exposure. And just keep in mind, this outer edge is the furthest thing from the surface, right? So the front here is closest to us. The edges of that soon-to-be bevel are furthest back, so they might be a little darker around the very perimeter of this. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define the, I'm going to put some of the lighter values that start to appear here might also appear there. So I'll go once again to my dodge tool, and I'll leave the brush, I'm going to make it about 8 pixels, and I'll leave the exposure at about 20. And I'm going to kind of zoom in on this so we can perhaps see it a little bit better. I want this maybe to be a little smaller, so now I'll just kind of go in and I'm going to go in and I'm going to hold my shift and kind of do this so that this reflective area might be a little bit more defined on those bevels. Maybe I'll put one over here. And I've got my exposure for 20. If it was too high, I could always drop it. And you may find yourself going back and forth and working these areas, but I'm going to put in the general design first before I enhance anything if I even need to. And I'll come over to here, and then in this area perhaps there'd be something maybe like that. All right, now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to deselect because I have to define the corners of the bevel plate. And I'm going to do that with my polygon lasso tool. So if I would hit L on the keyboard, I can now click and select right where I would like to work in that area. So the area I'm really interested in is right up in here, and perhaps a little down here when it comes to the darker values I'm going to burn in. So with that selection now, I'll go back to my dodge and burn. I'll hit O. And I'm going to get the burn tool again, and I'm going to make the brush a little smaller, and I might drop the exposure to about 40, and I'll start to work that corner. Now again, I would hide the selection so I have a better representation of what's going on. So that's starting to look pretty good. Now, contrary to, or in contrast to, excuse me, to the dark value here, we probably have a little bit lighter up here. So if I were to invert my selection by going to select inverse, I can now use that edge. Now, the thing you have to be careful of, there's no selection over here. So if you wanted to, you could reselect, or I could go ahead now, if I held my shift key and got my lasso, oops, Command Z, that would be the option, because we inverted our selection. I'm just increasing the parameters of that selection so that I wouldn't go down into here and maybe burn or dodge where I didn't want to. So now I'll go ahead and I'll get my dodge tool and I'll bump up the scale perhaps, and I'll start to go in this corner. And once again, I'd hit Command H so I could hide this and get a better idea of what I was doing here. So you can see how easy it is to imply the geometry we're trying to get here. And I would go around and do each corner the same way. Now I'm going to do each of the corners the same way. Then we'll come back and we'll do the screws for this plate as well. Now that we've completed the metal plate, we're going to go in and put the screws in it. So I'm going to get my marquee tool, my elliptical marquee, and I'm going to hold the shift and the option to drag a perfect circle in an area where some values are that I'd like to grab. And I'm taking an area where it's not completely flat gray or flat white, and it's pretty hard to do anyway, so maybe kind of a middle ground there. And I'll copy that to its own layer by hitting Command J. Now you won't see it until you go to the layer itself and you go to your FX and you choose Bevel and Emboss. And you'll see immediately it starts to push forward like a metal, kind of a metal sphere or an elliptical shape. Now, before I go and play with the actual beveling on this, I'm also going to put the outer glow because it's an easy way to separate out these elements that share same values. So that works pretty well. Now, as far as the setting, we don't want it to be so intrusive and obvious that we've used it, but we do want it to have enough of a presence so that we see the whole screw. So I'll leave you to decide the exact glow you'll want. Now, the next thing I want to do is play with that bevel. So I'll click on Bevel and Emboss. And I'm going to start perhaps by softening that. If it was set for chisel hard, I would like to have that a little softer on top. Usually a screw is kind of soft and roundish. So that looks pretty good to me. In order for this to seem to be a screw rather than just a rivet, I'm going to get my marquee, but now I'm going to go to the rectangle marquee. And I'm just going to click and drag a very thin rectangular shape and locate it in the center of that shape and hit delete. And you can see now we have a pretty respectable screw. Now there'll be 4 of them, one in each corner. And I can't emphasize enough scale, because if something is large, it looks disproportionate. It automatically looks very amateurish. So I've got one screw there, and I'm going to make a selection of the whole thing, and I'm going to option drag another one over to the other side. I'm going to rotate it. You can see I rotate that because what happens is that a screw never goes in perfectly straight, horizontally or vertically. There's always some sort of a diagonal to it, and that's what makes it seem realistic if you introduce that. Now that I have 2 of them, I'll marquee both of those, hit V on the keyboard, and then I'll option drag another row of them below like this. And then I'll deselect, and I'll probably select each one of these individually and give them just a little bit different an angle. And I'm just going to take a moment to kind of line these up a little better. Now that I have the plate done, I'm going to go to my layer window, and I'm holding down the Command key, and I'm going to click on the plate icon or thumbnail in the layer window. I'm going to go to Edit, Copy Merged. I'm going to return to the door panel that we created before, and I'm going to paste it in. And I'll scale it down and position it where I want. And again, you just want to be kind of aware of scale. And I'm going to zoom in on this because once I introduced it into my model or my door panel, the values needed to be fixed, because if we take a look at the value range of our door, this doesn't reach that value range. I'm going to go up to my layer with that new panel on it. I'll go to the black and white cookie, and I'm going to choose levels. And I'm going to lock the properties window at the very bottom. There's that white box that allows us to isolate adjustment layers to specific layers directly below. So when I click on that, anything that happens in here is going to affect just that. So I'll just start to play with these a bit and see if I can kind of bring these values in so I get a better range that's closer in keeping with the door as well. Now, once I've got that, I'll probably go down to the actual content layer, and I'll go to FX and I'll put an outer glow on that. So using this aged kind of a patina sort of a effect for this document so that it's consistent and it's got that feeling of perhaps being very old, kind of a warehouse that this bike shop is in. So I'll click OK, and now I'm going to tint it. So in order to tint it, I'm going to go to the top of my layer order. I'll introduce a new blank, and then I'm going to use my Command key to click and select once again the actual thumbnail of the plate. So I've got a blank layer at the top with the marching ends of the plate on it. I'm going to go and randomly pick a color here, so I think I'll just go and mix something a little here, and at this point it's really kind of subjective as well. And I'll use Option Delete to fill it. I'll deselect. I'm going to go to my Move tool, and when I do, I can now hold down my Shift key, and I can use my plus or minus key to go through these blend modes. And that'll give me a quick idea of where I want to go with this. Now I'm keeping two things in mind, obviously the way the color interacts with it, and if I see something I like and the values are too dark, I can always play with the transparency in addition to that. Kind of like that. I'm going with overlay, and as I said, this is really contingent upon the color that you've chosen. So now we've got our metal plate for our doorknob, and we've got the wood structure of our door complete.